Sarah Martinez's life began in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and despair. Her mother, Martinez, was only 23 years old when she gave birth to Sarah, and she was already in the grip of a methamphetamine addiction that would eventually destroy everything she touched. The nurses at County General Hospital noted in Sarah's medical file that the newborn showed signs of prenatal drug exposure, trembling, difficulty feeding, and an inability to soothe herself. Held her daughter for exactly 17 minutes before leaving her in the bassinet and asking for more pain medication. She never held Sarah again. For the first year of her life, Sarah lived with her mother in a cramped, filthy apartment on the east side of the city. The conditions were deplorable. Empty beer cans littered the floors. The refrigerator contained nothing but expired condiments. Sarah's father, a man named whose last name couldn't quite remember, had disappeared the moment she told him she was pregnant. He wanted nothing to do with a child, especially not a daughter of a drug addict. Sarah was left alone for hours while her mother attended to her addiction, sometimes locked in a playpen for her own safety, or rather, out of her mother's indifference. Everything changed on a cold February morning when a neighbor called Child Protective Services after hearing Sarah screaming for hours without anyone responding. When the caseworker arrived, she found 3-year-old Sarah. No, wait, Sarah was only 8 months old at that time, sitting in a soiled diaper in a dark room, her cries hoarse and weak. Was unconscious on the couch, surrounded by drug paraphernalia. The caseworker didn't hesitate. She called the police, and Sarah was removed from the home that same day. This was the first of many separations that would define Sarah's early life. The foster care carousel. Sarah's first foster home was with an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson who cared for 3 other children in addition to her own 2 teenage sons. Mrs. Henderson was kind but overwhelmed. She did her best, but with limited resources and too many mouths to feed, Sarah often felt lost in the shuffle. At 16 months old, Sarah was transferred again, this time to a home with a young couple, and Susan, who had been told they couldn't have biological children and were eager to foster to adopt. For 3 beautiful months, Sarah experienced something close to genuine love. Susan would sing to her, read her books with colorful pictures, and hold her close at night. Built a small wooden crib with his own hands, determined to create a safe space for this little girl. But then the adopted son from a previous foster placement began showing signs of severe behavioral problems. He was aggressive towards Sarah, and after an incident where he deliberately knocked her into a wall, the social services department deemed the home unsafe. Sarah was removed again, traumatized and confused. The third home belonged to Tors, a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, was loving but exhausted. She tried her best to give Sarah attention, but more often than not, Sarah spent her days in while worked herself to exhaustion. When herself experienced a health crisis, a collapsed lung that required emergency surgery, Sarah was transferred again. This time, there was no explanation given to the 2-year-old girl. She simply woke up in a strange house with strange people. The fourth home was temporary. A respite foster family meant for short-term care while the system tried to figure out where Sarah should go next. She stayed there for only 6 weeks. The foster father drank heavily, and his wife seemed indifferent to the children in her care. Sarah remembers, or the case file suggests she might remember, though it's hard to tell, a man yelling, a woman crying, and the terrible uncertainty that comes with never knowing if today would be her last day in a particular place. The fifth home was where she had been living for the past 18 months, with a middle-aged couple named Robert and Lisa. They were good people, truly decent human beings who had fostered 12 children over the years. But they were also people who didn't believe in attachment, who maintained a certain professional distance from their foster children because, as they often explained to social workers, getting too attached makes it harder when they leave. Sarah lived in their house like a guest in a hotel, with her own room, her own small dresser, her own shelf in the refrigerator. But she had no real place in their hearts. She was a paycheck, an obligation, a temporary responsibility. The silent protest. By the time Sarah turned 3, she had stopped trying. She had been told, not in words, because most of the adults in her life hadn't bothered to explain anything to her, that nothing was permanent. No home was forever. No one was truly hers. The lesson had been reinforced through 5 different living situations, 5 different sets of expectations, 5 different ways of being told, through action if not through words, that she wasn't quite right, wasn't quite enough, wasn't quite worth keeping. Sarah's response was to withdraw completely. The child who might have been a chatterbox, a bright-eyed toddler full of questions and energy, became almost catatonic. She stopped speaking. Not because she couldn't, the speech pathologist suggested she was physically capable of language, but because words seemed pointless. Speaking meant wanting things. Wanting things meant hopping for permanence. Hopping for permanence meant setting herself up for more disappointment. She stopped eating properly, turning her nose up at meals even when she was clearly hungry. She refused to engage with toys or other children. She developed severe separation anxiety, screaming whenever her case worker came for visits because she associated visits with transitions, with losing whatever fragile stability she had managed to build. The psychologist who evaluated her wrote in his report, "Subject demonstrates signs of severe attachment disorder, developmental delays, and possible permanent emotional damage from early childhood trauma and repeated placement transitions. Prognosis for successful family integration appears poor. Recommend continued therapeutic intervention and possible long-term residential placement." Reading those words, Sarah's caseworker felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces. Impossible mission. Had been working in Child Protective Services for 8 years, and in that time she had learned not to take cases personally. That was the unwritten rule of the job. Maintain professional distance, do the paperwork, make the placements, don't cry in your car afterward. But Sarah was different. There was something about this tiny, silent child that had gotten under skin in a way she couldn't quite explain. Had been assigned Sarah's case 2 years ago, and in that time she had watched the little girl deteriorate rather than improve. She had attended 5 placement meetings, supervised 3 unsuccessful visits, and filled out countless forms documenting Sarah's regression. Every night went home to her own family, her husband, her 2 biological children, her comfortable house in the suburbs. And she thought about Sarah sleeping in a bed that didn't belong to her, in a house where she was tolerated rather than loved. The system wasn't designed to help children like Sarah. It was designed to process them, manage them, keep them safe from immediate harm. But it wasn't designed to heal them, to give them hope, to help them trust again. The foster care system in America was broken, and Sarah was just one of thousands of children ground up by its gears every single day. Knew that without something dramatic, something unprecedented, Sarah would be aged out of the system at 18 and released into the world with no family, no support system, and no reason to believe that anyone had ever truly wanted her. She would become just another statistic, another sad story, another child lost to the system. That's why was desperate. That's why she was willing to try something crazy. Officer James pulled into the police station parking lot at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes earlier than his scheduled 6:00 a.m. shift start time. This was routine for him now. He needed those extra minutes to prepare himself mentally for whatever the day might bring. At 41 years old, James had been serving on the police force for 12 years, and in that time he had made his share of arrests, written countless tickets, and responded to more domestic violence calls than he cared to remember. He had seen the worst of humanity, the violence, the addiction, the desperation that drove people to destroy themselves and hurt others in the process. Most officers became jaded after a few years on the job. They developed a cynical worldview where they assumed the worst in people and steeled themselves against the emotional toll of witnessing human suffering day after day. But James had managed to maintain something that many of his colleagues had lost: hope. He parked his personal vehicle in his usual spot and walked toward the back entrance of the station. The September morning was cool and crisp. the kind of weather that made you feel alive. As he approached the K-9 unit facility, he heard a sound that never failed to brighten his mood, the excited bark of his partner. Dakota was already awake, alert, and ready for another day of work. The German Shepherd had been James's partner for 3 years now, and in that time, they had developed a bond that transcended the typical handler-dog relationship. They weren't just. They were brothers in every meaningful sense of the word. James unlocked the facility and stepped inside. Dakota bounded toward him with enthusiasm, his massive tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled. James crouched down and let the dog cover his face with enthusiastic licks. This greeting, this moment of pure, uncomplicated affection, had become the best part of James's day. No matter what had happened the previous evening, no matter what stress he was carrying, Dakota greeted him like he was the most important person in the world. There was no judgment in those amber eyes, no criticism, no expectation other than that they would spend the day together. The story of how James became a K-9 handler wasn't what most people would have expected. He had actually joined the force as a standard patrol officer, working traffic stops and neighborhood watch assignments. But everything changed the day he attended a K-9 unit demonstration at a community event. He watched as handlers worked their dogs through obstacle courses and scent detection exercises. He saw the precision, the discipline, the incredible bond between human and animal. But more than that, he witnessed something remarkable. The dogs seemed to sense when people were frightened or upset, and they responded with gentleness rather than aggression. It was like watching creatures of pure intuition and empathy in action. James completed the extensive K-9 handler training program 2 years after joining the force. The training was rigorous, requiring him to learn everything from canine behavioral psychology to advanced scent detection techniques to emergency medical procedures for animals. He worked with several dogs during the training, but he hadn't connected with any of them the way he connected with Dakota. When Dakota was assigned to him 3 years ago, it was like meeting the other half of his soul. The dog had been rescued from an abusive situation where he had been trained only for aggression and protection. Most handlers would have rejected Dakota because of his unpredictable temperament and trauma history. But James saw potential where others saw damaged goods. He spent the first 6 months of their partnership working with a trauma-specialized veterinarian and a canine behaviorist to help Dakota heal from his past. He learned that Dakota, like humans, carried emotional scars that needed patient, consistent healing. He worked with Dakota at home and at the station, building trust through repetition and unconditional positive reinforcement. James's wife, initially worried that bringing a traumatized police dog home was a dangerous decision. But she watched as her husband transformed Dakota from an anxious, aggressive animal into the gentlest, most intuitive dog she had ever met. It was during his 2nd year with Dakota that James noticed something extraordinary happening during routine patrol work. They would arrive at scenes with traumatized children, and Dakota would somehow know exactly what to do. The dog wouldn't be aggressive or hyperactive. Instead, Dakota would approach slowly, lower his head, and simply exist in the same space as the frightened child. And the child would calm down. Parents who had been unable to comfort their own children watched in amazement, as this massive German Shepherd accomplished in seconds what they couldn't accomplish in minutes. James began keeping informal notes. He documented cases where Dakota's presence seemed to have a positive psychological effect on victims and suspects alike. Criminals who had been aggressive suddenly became compliant when Dakota entered a room. Victims of trauma who had been unable to speak to officers found themselves opening up to this gentle animal. Children who were terrified by the police felt safe around Dakota. The data was anecdotal but compelling. James became convinced that Dakota's gift wasn't limited to narcotics detection and security work. Dakota had a special talent for healing. He approached the police captain with an unusual proposal: allow him to volunteer Dakota's services in family court proceedings, specifically in custody and child welfare cases. The captain thought he was crazy. This wasn't a standard police function. There was no precedent for it. But James was persistent and passionate in his arguments. He gave presentations to the captain, to judges, to social workers. He showed them research about the therapeutic benefits of animal-assisted interventions. He explained his theory about how animals could create a bridge between traumatized people and the legal system. Slowly, skepticism turned into cautious acceptance. The first family court appearance was awkward and uncertain. Nobody quite knew what they were doing, but the results were undeniable. An 8-year-old boy who hadn't spoken since witnessing domestic violence suddenly whispered a sentence to Dakota. A teenage girl who was terrified of the legal process sat beside Dakota throughout her testimony and found the courage to speak against her abuser. A 3-year-old who had been silent for 6 months looked at Dakota, and something shifted in her eyes. Something awakened. Word spread through the family court system. Judges started requesting Dakota's presence at hearings. Social workers began scheduling cases specifically around Dakota's availability. James's colleagues, who had initially mocked his therapy dog obsession, began to understand that they were witnessing something genuinely powerful. Dakota wasn't just a police dog doing a job. Dakota was an agent of healing, a bridge between broken people and hope. Watched her husband's passion grow with each successful court appearance. She saw how the work fulfilled something in James that traditional police work never had. He came home not exhausted and cynical, but energized and hopeful. He talked about the children he had met, the families that had been reunited, the traumas that had been addressed through Dakota's quiet, gentle presence. Realized that her husband had found his true calling, and that calling wasn't about catching criminals or making arrests. It was about using the extraordinary gift of his dog to heal the most vulnerable members of society. James had no way of knowing that his willingness to think differently, his refusal to accept that police work had to be purely about enforcement, and his deep faith in Dakota's abilities would eventually change the course of 4 lives forever. He couldn't have predicted that a routine court appearance on an ordinary Tuesday morning would become the most significant moment of his entire life. But as he finished his preparation that morning, scratching behind Dakota's ears and looking into the dog's soulful eyes, James felt a familiar sense of anticipation. He didn't know what this day would bring, but he trusted that wherever he and Dakota went, they would somehow make a difference. Sat in her cluttered office at the Department of Child Services, staring at the Sarah Martinez file with a mixture of desperation and determination. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late September, and she had been awake since 4:30 a.m., unable to sleep as her mind cycled obsessively through the details of this impossible case. The file itself was worn and dog-eared from being opened and closed so many times over the past 2 years. Sticky notes covered almost every page, each one containing personal observations, questions that remained unanswered, and increasingly frantic reminders to herself to find a solution before it was too late. Sarah's hearing was scheduled for 10:00 a.m. that morning, and had made a decision that her supervisor had strongly advised against. She had requested that Officer James and Dakota be present for the proceeding. The request had been met with confusion and resistance. Family court hearings were formal, structured affairs governed by strict procedures and precedents. There was no provision in the code for police dogs to attend hearings. The idea seemed unprofessional, perhaps even chaotic. How could the court function properly with an animal in the room? What if the dog became distracted or aggressive? What if it somehow disrupted the proceedings? Had spent an hour on the phone the previous evening arguing her case to Judge Harold, the judge assigned to Sarah's hearing. She explained Dakota's background, his training, his remarkable track record in other courtroom settings. She talked about the research on animal-assisted interventions and trauma recovery. She described Sarah's complete shutdown, her refusal to engage with traditional therapeutic approaches, and her apparent complete loss of hope. Judge listened politely but remained skeptical. He agreed to allow Dakota to be present, but only as an observer. The dog could be in the courtroom, but he expected Officer to maintain complete control at all times. Any disruption whatsoever, and the dog would be removed immediately. Understood that this was her one shot. If this didn't work, if Dakota's presence didn't somehow reach Sarah in ways that months of therapy and assessment had failed to do, then Sarah would likely be moved to a group residential facility. The prospects after that were grim. Studies showed that children who were placed in institutional settings after being in the foster care system were significantly more likely to develop serious behavioral problems, substance abuse issues, and mental health disorders. They were more likely to become homeless, incarcerated, or trapped in cycles of poverty and desperation. Sarah's future hinged on what happened in the next few hours. The courtroom itself was located in the family court building, a relatively modern structure that attempted to be less intimidating than traditional courthouse architecture. The walls were painted soft colors, the furniture was less imposing than in criminal courts, and there were even some toys and books in the waiting areas to make the space feel less threatening to children. But no matter how much effort was invested in making family court seem welcoming, it remained fundamentally a place where important decisions were made about children's lives and futures. It was a place where children were shuffled between homes, where parental rights were terminated, where families were broken apart or, occasionally, miraculously reunited. Arrived at the courthouse at 8:45 a.m., 45 minutes before the scheduled hearing. She went through her mental checklist one more time. Sarah was being dropped off by her current foster parents, Robert and Lisa, at 9:30 a.m. Officer had agreed to arrive at 9:45 a.m. with Dakota, giving them a few minutes to settle the dog before the hearing began. The social worker who had been working with Sarah for the past 6 months was prepared to give testimony about the child's emotional state and the challenges of finding appropriate placement. The psychologist would present his assessment, though knew that report was essentially a death sentence to Sarah's chances for family placement. The prosecutor, who in family court proceedings was usually an advocate for the child's best interests, would argue for whatever placement option seemed most viable given the constraints of the system. Sarah arrived at the courthouse looking small and fragile in a pink dress that hung loosely on her tiny frame. Gave her a gentle hug, which Sarah tolerated without returning the embrace. The child's eyes were downcast, her expression blank. She had been told nothing about what would happen today. Had learned long ago that it was sometimes better not to give foster children advance warning about hearings or placements, because children often internalized such information as yet another rejection, another confirmation that nothing in their lives was stable or permanent. At 9:47 a.m., Officer arrived with Dakota. He was dressed in his police uniform, every detail perfectly aligned. Dakota wore his service harness and moved with the calm, dignified bearing that suggested he understood the seriousness of his purpose. Greeted James with a handshake and whispered thanks for his willingness to participate in what she knew was an unconventional request. James simply nodded. He had learned to trust judgment over the years. He had observed her dedication to the children in her caseload and her willingness to think creatively and pursue unconventional solutions when standard approaches weren't working. The courtroom filled gradually with the various parties involved in Sarah's case. Judge entered last, taking his position behind the elevated bench with a measured, deliberate demeanor. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had presided over family court cases for 32 years and had developed a reputation for being fair but strict, professional but not unkind. He had seen thousands of children pass through his courtroom, and he maintained a careful emotional distance from their cases. It was a necessary defense mechanism for someone in his position. If you allowed yourself to become emotionally invested in every case, you would burn out within 5 years. Judge called the hearing to order at 10:00 a.m. sharp. The formal proceedings began with the prosecutor presenting Sarah's case file and history. The judge listened as the details of Sarah's traumatic early life, her 5 placements, her developmental delays, her behavioral issues, and her current emotional state were in official language. Sarah sat between and the court-appointed child advocate, a woman named Tors who had been assigned to represent Sarah's interests in the legal proceedings. As the prosecutor droned on through the technical aspects of the case, Sarah sat perfectly still, staring at nothing. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her expression was empty. She looked like a small doll that had been wound up and set in motion by outside forces, with no internal animating spirit driving her actions or her thoughts. Judge glanced occasionally in Sarah's direction, but showed no visible emotional response to what he was seeing. The hearing continued with testimony from the social worker, who described the challenges of placing Sarah in a family setting. The psychologist presented his assessment, with its discouraging conclusions about attachment disorders and limited prospects for successful family integration. The foster parents, Robert and Lisa, gave brief testimony about Sarah's needs and their recognition that they were not equipped to provide her with the specialized attention her case required. Everything was proceeding exactly as had feared it would, toward a conclusion that Sarah would be moved to institutional care. Then Judge glanced at the clock. He noted that the formal testimony had been completed. There was nothing left to do but render a preliminary decision about Sarah's placement. He was about to speak when Officer suddenly shifted in his seat. Dakota, who had been lying quietly on the floor beside James throughout the entire proceeding, lifted his head as if responding to some signal that nobody else had perceived. The courtroom fell into a strange, expectant silence. Judge had set down his pen and was preparing to speak, to deliver the preliminary ruling that would determine the immediate future of Sarah Martinez. The other attorneys had begun gathering their files, assuming the hearing was essentially concluded. The social worker was already mentally preparing for the paperwork that would transfer Sarah to the residential facility. Everything was moving toward an inevitable conclusion that nobody in that room seemed capable of preventing. And then something happened that nobody could have predicted or orchestrated, something that existed outside the normal parameters of courtroom procedure and logic. Dakota lifted his head. It was such a small movement, such an insignificant gesture in the grand scheme of things, that most people in the courtroom barely noticed it. Officer felt the shift in energy from his dog immediately. In their 3 years together, James had learned to read Dakota's subtle signals with an intuition that bordered on telepathic. When Dakota lifted his head like that, when his ears perked up and his body became alert despite his relaxed position, it meant Dakota had detected something significant. The dog's extraordinary senses had picked up on something that human perception had missed. James looked around the courtroom to see what might have captured Dakota's attention. At first, he saw nothing unusual. The judge was bent over his desk. The attorneys were shuffling papers. The social workers were making notes. But then his eyes landed on Sarah, and something in his chest tightened with recognition and understanding. Sarah was looking at Dakota, not just looking, but truly seeing him. Her eyes, which had been vacant and empty throughout the entire hearing, suddenly contained a spark of something. It was subtle, so faint that someone who didn't know to look for it might have missed it entirely. But it was there. Life, recognition, awareness. Sarah's head had turned slightly, almost imperceptibly. Her gaze was locked on Dakota with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something in the dog that nobody else in the courtroom could perceive. It was as if an invisible connection had suddenly formed between the traumatized child and the gentle German shepherd, a bridge of understanding that transcended language and conventional communication. James felt his throat tighten. In all his years of bringing Dakota to courtroom hearings, he had never experienced a moment quite like this. He had witnessed children comfort themselves with Dakota's presence, had seen scared witnesses find courage in the dog's calm demeanor, but this was different. This was something more profound, more fundamental. This was two broken beings recognizing each other across a room filled with people and systems and procedures that had failed them both. Judge noticed the shift in Sarah's focus. He paused in the act of writing, his pen hovering above the document in front of him. His eyes followed Sarah's gaze across the courtroom to where Dakota sat, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained professional composure wavered slightly. He saw what was happening. He understood, on some level that transcended his 32 years of judicial detachment, that something significant was occurring. Stood up abruptly from her chair, her entire body suddenly tense with anticipation. She had requested Dakota's presence based on research and intuition and desperation, but even she hadn't truly expected anything dramatic to happen. The system didn't work that way. Change didn't happen in sudden, miraculous moments. Change was bureaucratic and incremental and painfully slow, but she was watching it happen in real time. She was watching a closed-off, traumatized child begin to open up in response to the presence of a gentle dog. Sarah's small hand lifted from her lap. It rose slowly, hesitantly, as if she was unsure whether she was allowed to move or speak or acknowledge what she was seeing. Her tiny fingers trembled slightly as they extended across the empty space between her body and Dakota. She wasn't reaching for Dakota physically. The dog was too far away for that. Instead, she was pointing. Her index finger extended outward in a gesture that carried tremendous weight and significance. Officer saw the pointing gesture, and immediately he understood what Sarah was communicating. Without waiting for permission or protocol or any formal instruction, James stood up from his seat. He kept Dakota's leash slack but maintained gentle control as he guided the dog across the courtroom. The movement was deliberate and slow, calculated to be as non-threatening and peaceful as possible. This wasn't a formal procedure or an approved courtroom action. James was making a split-second decision to override protocol in response to something he sensed Sarah needed. Judge didn't object. Some part of his judicial training suggested he should stop this inappropriate interruption of formal courtroom procedure. But another part of him, a part that had been buried under years of professional distance and emotional detachment, recognized that something authentic and important was happening. He remained silent. Dakota moved across the courtroom with graceful dignity, his massive frame somehow making the space feel smaller and more intimate. His tail moved slowly, deliberately, not with excited energy, but with calm confidence. The dog had done this hundreds of times before, approaching traumatized people with the understanding that gentleness was the only appropriate response. Sarah's pointing finger never wavered. Her eyes never left Dakota's face. As the dog drew closer, Sarah's hand extended further, and her small fingers finally made contact with Dakota's soft fur. She touched him tentatively at first, as if she was afraid he might disappear, as if this moment might be taken away from her the way everything else had been taken away. But then, as she felt the solid warmth of the dog beneath her fingertips, something shifted in her entire body. Her shoulders, which had been hunched forward in their characteristic posture of defensiveness and withdrawal, began to relax. Her face, which had been locked in an expression of emptiness and emotional distance, began to show signs of animation. Her breathing, which had been shallow and controlled, became deeper and more natural. It was as if oxygen was flowing into her system for the first time in months, as if her nervous system was finally receiving permission to relax from its constant state of hypervigilance and self-protection. Dakota lowered his massive head, bringing his face close to Sarah's. The dog didn't try to lick her face or jump on her or engage in any of the typical enthusiastic greeting, behaviors that untrained dogs might have exhibited. Instead, Dakota simply existed in close proximity to Sarah, allowing the child to stroke his fur, to make contact with another living being without judgment or reservation or fear of abandonment. The entire courtroom had gone completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The attorneys forgot their arguments. The social workers forgot their files. The judge forgot his judicial responsibilities. Everyone was watching something that transcended the normal boundaries of what happened in a courtroom, something that existed in a realm of pure human connection and emotional authenticity. Sarah continued to touch Dakota, her small hand moving across the dog's head and neck. And then, after nearly a minute of this contact, after nearly a minute of touching another living being without fear or hesitation, Sarah's mouth opened. It was subtle at first, just a slight parting of her lips. But then the muscles in her throat began to move. Air began to flow. Sound began to emerge from a voice that had been silent for so many months that nobody was even certain it still functioned properly. In that moment, suspended between past trauma and future possibility, between a system that had failed her and a dog that seemed to understand her perfectly, Sarah Martinez prepared to speak words that would change everything. The silence in the courtroom had become almost unbearable, a pregnant pause that seemed to stretch across time and space with an intensity that nobody could have predicted or prepared for. Sarah's hand continued to move across Dakota's fur, her fingers tracing the contours of the dog's head and neck with a tenderness that suggested she was discovering something precious and irreplaceable. Her mouth remained slightly open, and everyone in the room could sense that something was building, that words were forming in her throat, that she was gathering the courage to break a silence that had defined her existence for far too long. Officer stood motionless beside Dakota, barely breathing, afraid that any sudden movement or sound might shatter this delicate moment. He had trained Dakota to remain calm and gentle in situations with traumatized people, but he had never seen his partner respond to a child with quite this level of intuitive understanding. It was as if Dakota had somehow stepped outside of his normal consciousness and entered into a deeper realm of communication with Sarah, a place where words were unnecessary, because the connection was happening on a level that transcended language entirely. Judge had stopped writing completely. His pen rested on his desk, forgotten. His eyes, which had surveyed countless cases with professional detachment, were now fixed on the interaction between the child and the dog with an intensity that suggested his entire worldview was being challenged, and in real time. In 32 years of presiding over family court cases, he had never witnessed anything remotely like this. He had seen children cry. He had seen children express anger and confusion and fear. But he had never seen a child appear to be experiencing a genuine breakthrough, a moment where the barriers between self and world, between fear and trust, were dissolving in the presence of another being. Felt tears beginning to stream down her face, though she made no effort to wipe them away. She had requested Dakota's presence based on research and hope and desperation, but she had not allowed herself to truly believe that something like this could actually happen. The system didn't work this way. Children didn't suddenly begin to heal because of the presence of a dog in a courtroom. That wasn't how psychology worked. That wasn't how the foster care system functioned. And yet, she was watching it happen. She was witnessing a moment of genuine human-animal connection that seemed to operate according to rules that transcended conventional understanding. Sarah's breathing had become more rhythmic, more natural. Her entire body had shifted into a position of openness and receptivity that had been completely absent throughout the entire hearing. The psychologist who had written his damning assessment of Sarah's condition sat in his chair with his mouth slightly open, his professional certainty beginning to crack under the weight of what he was witnessing. He had concluded, based on years of training and experience, that Sarah was permanently damaged, that her capacity for attachment had been too severely compromised by early trauma. But Sarah was attaching right now. Sarah was demonstrating a capacity for love and connection and trust in response to Dakota's gentle presence. The court-appointed child advocate, Tors, began to understand why I had fought so hard to get Dakota into this courtroom. Had worked in child welfare for 18 years, and she had developed a healthy skepticism about the system's ability to genuinely help children. But in this moment, she was witnessing something that felt like genuine help, genuine healing, genuine hope. She found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the magnetic field of what was happening between Sarah and Dakota. Sarah's hand stilled on Dakota's head. She was gathering herself, preparing for something. The trembling in her fingers intensified slightly, and her eyes squeezed shut for just a moment, as if she was drawing courage from some deep internal source. Her throat moved. The muscles in her neck tensed. Everyone in the courtroom understood that words were coming. The question was not whether she would speak, but what she would say. And then, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper, a voice that had been silent for so long that some people in the room had begun to wonder if she was even capable of speech, Sarah opened her mouth and spoke. The words came out slowly, deliberately, each syllable carrying the weight of months of silence and isolation and emotional shutdown. The voice itself was small and uncertain, as if she wasn't completely confident in her right to make sound, to claim space in the world through vocalization. "My dog." 2 words. Just 2 simple words, spoken so softly that some people in the back of the courtroom had to lean forward to make certain they had heard correctly. 2 words that should have been unremarkable, that should have been completely ordinary in any other context. But in this moment, in this courtroom, surrounded by judges and lawyers and social workers and systems that had failed this child so completely, those 2 words carried the force of an explosion. The moment the words left Sarah's mouth, something fundamental shifted in the room's energy. Judge felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, something that had not happened during a family court proceeding in his 32 years on the bench. He set down his pen with a gentle clink that seemed impossibly loud in the absolute silence that had fallen over the courtroom. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to the bridge of his nose, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just witnessed. Stood up from her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight while remaining seated. She pressed her hands to her mouth, muffling the sob that was threatening to escape. Her entire body shook with the release of months of stress and worry and desperate hope finally being vindicated. The tears flowed freely now, and she made no attempt to hide them or maintain professional composure. The court-appointed child advocate began weeping openly. The social worker who had documented Sarah's behavioral problems found herself crying as well, her understanding of Sarah's condition being rewritten by those 2 simple words. The prosecutor, who represented the child's best interests, felt moisture streaming down her face as she contemplated what those words meant. They meant that Sarah could speak. They meant that Sarah could connect. They meant that Sarah was not permanently damaged. They meant that recovery was possible. Officer felt his throat close with emotion, and he had to turn away for a moment, unable to maintain his professional demeanor in the face of what he was witnessing. He had brought Dakota to dozens of courtroom hearings, but he had never seen his partner affect a child so profoundly in such a short period of time. He had never felt so certain that the work they were doing, the unusual work of bringing a trauma-trained dog into legal proceedings, was exactly what this situation required. Dakota remained perfectly still beside Sarah, his massive head resting gently against the child's small body. The dog seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He remained calm and present, not celebrating or expressing excitement, but simply continuing to exist in this space of connection and healing that had somehow been created. Sarah's hand continued to rest on Dakota's head, and her eyes, which had been empty and vacant just minutes before, now contained something that looked remarkably like hope. She repeated the words more clearly, with more confidence, as if testing her voice, as if discovering that speaking was not dangerous, that claiming ownership of something or someone in the world was actually permissible. "My dog," she said again, this time with a certainty that suggested she understood exactly what those words meant and what they represented. Not just a statement about Dakota's existence in her life, but a declaration of belonging, of attachment, of finding something in the world that would not be taken away from her. In those 2 words, Sarah had communicated something that months of therapy and assessment had failed to capture: her capacity to love, to trust, to believe in permanence and connection. The courtroom erupted into a silence that was somehow louder than any audible sound could have been. It was the silence of collective emotional overwhelm, the silence of systems and certainties being dismantled in real time, the silence of people confronting the limits of their understanding and the vastness of what they did not know about healing and human connection. Judge stood up from behind his elevated bench, an action that violated every protocol of courtroom decorum. Judges did not stand up in response to emotional moments. Judges maintained their positions of authority and distance, but Harold found himself unable to remain seated. His body moved of its own accord, driven by something more powerful than professional training or years of practiced emotional detachment. He removed his glasses slowly, and as he did, tears that he had been holding back finally spilled over and streamed down his weathered face. In the 32 years that Harold had been presiding over family court cases, he had learned to build walls between his personal emotions and his professional responsibilities. He had developed the ability to hear the most heartbreaking stories, to witness the dissolution of families, to make decisions that would fundamentally alter children's lives, all while maintaining a carefully controlled exterior. But those walls were crumbling now, collapsing under the weight of witnessing genuine healing emerging from an unexpected source. He looked at Sarah, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had entered the courtroom that morning. He saw not the case file, not the statistics and assessments and diagnoses, but a human being, a 3-year-old girl who had endured more trauma than most adults would survive, who had been bounced between 5 different homes, who had been told through action and circumstance that she was not worth keeping, not worth fighting for, not worth the investment of genuine love and care. And yet, in the presence of a dog, she had found something worth speaking for. She had found a reason to break her silence, to risk vulnerability, to reach out into a world that had consistently disappointed and betrayed her. Had moved toward Sarah, her professional boundaries completely dissolved in the face of what was happening. She crouched beside the child, keeping her movements slow and gentle so as not to disrupt the profound connection that Sarah had established with Dakota. Tears streamed down her face as she placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, and for perhaps the first time, Sarah did not flinch away from human touch. Instead, Sarah leaned slightly into his embrace, her hand still resting on Dakota's head, her attention still focused on the dog who had somehow reached the place in her psyche that trained therapists had been unable to access. The social worker, Maria Santos, who had been documenting Sarah's case for the past 6 months, felt her entire professional framework collapsing around her. She had presented Sarah's case with clinical precision, had noted her behavioral problems and emotional delays with objective language, designed to support the conclusion that Sarah needed institutional placement. But she was watching that conclusion be rendered completely obsolete by the simple fact of Sarah's capacity to connect, to speak, to express attachment and love. Maria found herself standing up from her chair, unable to remain seated while this moment unfolded. Her legs carried her forward almost involuntarily, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing something genuine and transformative happening in real time. The court-appointed prosecutor, Williams, sat with her hands pressed to her chest, her eyes streaming with tears. Had built a career on representing children's interests within the legal system, and she had become accustomed to the grim reality that many cases could not be resolved in ways that truly served the child's. The foster care system was broken, resources were limited, and outcomes were often tragic. But this case was different. This case was demonstrating that sometimes, miraculously, the answer to a child's trauma could come from the most unexpected source. Sometimes healing could emerge from the simple connection between a child and an animal, from a moment of genuine understanding that transcended all the conventional therapeutic and legal approaches. The psychologist, Dr. Robert, who had written his pessimistic assessment of Sarah's condition, sat in stunned silence. His entire professional identity was rooted in the belief that trauma created permanent psychological damage, that early childhood attachment disorders were essentially incurable, that certain children were too broken to be saved. But Sarah was contradicting that assessment with every breath she took in Dakota's presence. She was demonstrating resilience and capacity for connection that his assessments had not predicted. Doctor found himself questioning the foundations of his own professional certainty, wondering how many other children he had evaluated and written off as permanently damaged when the answer to their healing might have been something as simple and profound as the presence of a trained therapy animal. Officer James stood beside Dakota with his hand gently resting on the dog's back, marveling at what he was witnessing. In all his years of bringing Dakota to courtrooms, he had believed in the dog's healing abilities, but this moment transcended anything he had experienced before. He was watching his partner facilitate the breakthrough of a traumatized child, was witnessing the power of animal-assisted intervention in its form. He felt a profound sense of gratitude toward Dakota, toward the decision he had made to trust his instincts about the dog's gift, toward the moment when he had chosen to pursue this unconventional path rather than follow the traditional expectations of his career. Sarah spoke again, her voice becoming slightly louder, slightly more confident. She repeated the words with a clarity that suggested she was testing them, discovering that language could be a tool for expressing her needs and her desires and her capacity for love. My dog, my dog. Each repetition seemed to strengthen her conviction, to anchor her more firmly in the reality that she had found something worth claiming, something worth speaking for, something worth opening her heart to despite all the disappointment and betrayal she had experienced. The entire courtroom seemed to be holding its collective breath, suspended in a moment that existed outside of time and procedure and legal protocol. The case before them was no longer just about paperwork and placement decisions. It had become about something far more fundamental, about the nature of healing, about the power of connection, about the possibility of recovery emerging from the most unexpected sources. Judge returned to his desk and looked at the file in front of him, the psychological assessment, the social worker's report, the documentation of Sarah's behavioral challenges. And in that moment, he understood that this file, comprehensive as it was, had missed something essential about Sarah's nature. It had missed her capacity for resilience. It had missed her ability to connect. It had missed the fundamental truth that Sarah was not broken beyond repair, that she was capable of growth and attachment and love, that she deserved a chance at a real family and a genuine future. He looked at Officer and Dakota, and he understood what had just happened in his courtroom. This was not just a family court hearing. This was a moment where a broken system had somehow, miraculously, aligned in a way that allowed genuine healing to occur. This was a moment where the impossible had become possible, where a traumatized child had found her voice and claimed her right to belong to someone, to something, to a future that held hope rather than despair. The tears continued to flow from nearly every person in the courtroom. The attorneys, the social workers, the judge, the child advocate, the psychologist, all of them were experiencing a moment of genuine awakening, a recognition that the conventional approaches they had been trained in had profound limitations, that sometimes the answer to a child's pain came from outside the system entirely, from a place of pure connection and intuitive understanding. That evening, Officer James sat in his living room with a cup of untouched coffee growing cold on the side table. He had been attempting to explain what had happened in the courtroom, but words seemed inadequate to capture the magnitude of the experience. Listened intently, watching her husband's face transform as he recounted the details. She had always known that James was passionate about his work with Dakota, but she had never seen him quite like this, shaken, emotional, fundamentally changed by what he had witnessed. She spoke for the first time in over a year, James said, his voice still trembling slightly. Just 2 words, my dog. But those 2 words changed everything. The entire courtroom was crying. The judge, the lawyers, everyone. It was like watching someone wake up from a coma. Moved closer to her husband and took his hand. She had been married to James for 15 years, and she knew that he was a man of deep feeling beneath his police officer exterior. She also knew that despite their 15 years together, despite their comfortable life in their suburban home with their 2 cats and their garden, there had always been something missing from their family. They had wanted children desperately. They had tried for years. They had fertility treatments that had been emotionally devastating and financially draining. Eventually, they had accepted that biological children were not meant to be part of their story. But James had never quite accepted it. Could see it in the way he looked at children when they were out in public. She could see it in the way his face lit up when his nieces and nephews visited. She could see it in his quiet moments when he thought she wasn't looking, moments when the disappointment of their childlessness seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. "What happened after she spoke?" asked gently. "The caseworker, she pulled me aside during the recess," James continued. "She told me about Sarah's history. This girl has been through more trauma than most adults will ever experience. 5 different foster homes, a mother addicted to methamphetamine, no stable family, no sense of belonging anywhere. And yet, in the presence of Dakota, something shifted, something healed. The caseworker believes that if Sarah could connect with Dakota like that, then maybe, just maybe, she could connect with a real family." James paused and watched as her husband's eyes filled with tears again. She had never seen him so emotionally exposed, so vulnerable, so completely transformed by a single experience. "Ask me something," James said quietly. "She asked if we had ever considered fostering or adopting a child. She said that most adoption agencies wouldn't work with us because of Dakota, but she wondered if we might be willing to pursue this anyway. She said she believed Sarah was meant to be part of our family." Felt her own throat close with emotion. She understood immediately what her husband was asking, what was proposing. She understood that this was an opportunity that had seemed impossible just hours before, an answer to a prayer they had stopped praying because they had lost hope. But she also understood the magnitude of what they would be taking on. Sarah was traumatized. She had significant emotional and developmental needs. She would require patience and understanding, and a willingness to accept that healing was not a linear process. Without hesitation, without allowing herself to overthink or second-guess, said the words that her heart had been wanting to say for years. "Yes, we should do this. We should bring Sarah home." The adoption process was far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. The social workers who conducted their home study seemed skeptical about the wisdom of placing a severely traumatized child with a family that owned a large dog. There were concerns about Sarah's unpredictability, about whether Dakota might pose a threat if Sarah had a behavioral episode, about whether James and were truly equipped to handle a child with such profound emotional needs. But fought for them. She presented the evidence of Dakota's effect on Sarah. She showed the video recording of the courtroom hearing, played those 2 words, "my dog," for the adoption panel. She argued passionately that Sarah and Dakota had a connection that transcended typical human-animal relationships, that this connection was actually Sarah's greatest asset in her recovery, that separating Sarah from Dakota would be profoundly harmful to the child's. And James attended a series of parenting classes and trauma-informed care training courses. They learned about attachment disorders and how to recognize the signs of trauma reenactment. They learned about the importance of consistency and safety and unconditional love in helping traumatized children begin to heal. They learned that parenting a child who had been severely traumatized required a level of patience and emotional sophistication that went far beyond typical parenting challenges. But most importantly, they began spending time with Sarah. The social services department arranged for Sarah to spend weekends at their home while the official adoption process unfolded. The first weekend was awkward and uncertain. Sarah clung to Dakota, barely acknowledging James's presence. She didn't speak. She barely ate. She seemed to exist in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scanning her environment for threats, unable to relax or trust that this situation was anything other than temporary. but Dakota seemed to understand his role in Sarah's healing journey. The dog never left Sarah's side. When she had nightmares, Dakota slept beside her bed, offering comfort through his quiet presence. When she was frightened or overwhelmed, Dakota would position himself between Sarah and the perceived threat, creating a sense of safety and protection. When she began to venture out into the backyard, Dakota led the way, his presence somehow making the world feel less terrifying. Week by week, Sarah began to change. Her eating improved. Her sleep became less disrupted by nightmares. She began to speak short phrases to James, and though most of her communication remained directed toward Dakota, she started to smile occasionally, tentative smiles that suggested she was beginning to experience moments of genuine happiness rather than just survival. By the fourth weekend visit, Sarah had stopped clinging to Dakota every moment and had instead begun to explore her new environment with slightly more confidence. She found the sandbox in the backyard and spent an hour running her fingers through the sand, seemingly fascinated by the sensation. James observed from the porch, giving her space while remaining nearby, understanding that her comfort with physical space was a sign of increasing emotional security. Noticed something remarkable during the sixth weekend visit. Sarah was sitting on the couch between Dakota, watching an animated movie. At one point, she leaned her head against shoulder, a gesture so small and ordinary that most people would not have recognized its significance. But James understood that this was a major breakthrough. Sarah had voluntarily accepted physical affection from. She had allowed herself to be close to another human being in a way that suggested trust and safety were beginning to develop. The adoption paperwork moved slowly through the bureaucratic system, but the outcome had become inevitable. The initial skeptics had been convinced by the evidence of Sarah's progress. The psychologist who had written his damning assessment admitted that he had underestimated Sarah's capacity for recovery. The social workers who had worried about Dakota's presence in the home began to understand that the dog was actually Sarah's greatest therapeutic asset. After 6 months of weekends and careful preparation, the adoption was officially approved by the court system. Sarah Martinez would become Sarah. She would no longer be a foster child passed between homes. She would have a permanent family that wanted her, that loved her, that had fought through a complicated system to bring her home. And she would have Dakota, the dog who had somehow reached into her damaged psyche and given her permission to heal, to trust, to believe in permanence and love. The morning of the finalization hearing arrived with brilliant sunshine streaming through the windows of James's home. Sarah woke early, as she had been doing for the past several months, and immediately reached for Dakota, who was sleeping on the rug beside her bed. The ritual had become automatic for her, this first gesture of reassurance upon waking, the need to confirm that Dakota was still there, that nothing had been taken away from her in the darkness of sleep. Dakota stretched and yawned, his massive body suddenly filling the small bedroom with warmth and presence. James stood in the doorway watching them for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this day. Today, in a few hours, Sarah would officially become their daughter. The word daughter still felt somewhat surreal to him, as if he was not entirely certain he had the right to claim such a profound role. But looking at Sarah in her white dress with her hair carefully braided by, watching her stroke Dakota's ears with increasing confidence and affection, James understood that he had already been her father for months. Today was simply the moment when the legal system would catch up with what his heart already knew. Had prepared breakfast, Sarah's favorite pancakes with blueberries arranged in a smiley face pattern. Sarah had a tendency to play with her food rather than eat it, but she was eating significantly more than she had when she first arrived. The pediatrician had noted at her last checkup that Sarah's growth seemed to be accelerating now that she was in a stable, nurturing environment. Her developmental delays were beginning to close. Her speech was expanding beyond the initial 2 words that had changed everything. She was beginning to sound like a normal 3-year-old, with all the curiosity and energy and occasional stubbornness that came with that age. "Are you ready for today?" asked Sarah, sitting beside her at the breakfast table, had learned not to assume that Sarah understood her words completely, but she also understood that Sarah's comprehension was improving rapidly. Language acquisition seemed to accelerate when a child felt safe and loved. Sarah looked up from her pancakes and pointed at Dakota, who was lying on his dog bed in the corner of the kitchen, ever watchful, ever protective. "My dog, my family," Sarah said clearly, her voice growing stronger and more confident with each passing week. James felt tears threatening to spill over. Those 4 words, "my dog, my family," represented an enormous leap in Sarah's communication and her emotional understanding. She was no longer just claiming Dakota. She was claiming them. She was asserting her belonging to this family unit, her understanding that she was part of something permanent and real. They arrived at the courthouse at 9:30 a.m., and the building was already filled with people who wanted to witness the finalization of Sarah's adoption. Was there, dressed in professional attire, her face radiant with the satisfaction of a caseworker who had fought for a child and had been proven right. The social workers who had worked with Sarah were present. The psychologist, Dr. Robert, had requested to attend, wanting to be part of this moment and to acknowledge how profoundly his understanding of trauma recovery had been challenged and expanded. Judge had specifically requested to be the judge overseeing the finalization hearing, even though he could have delegated it to another judge. The courtroom itself had been transformed for this occasion. Instead of the somber, heavy atmosphere of typical family court proceedings, there was an almost celebratory energy. People were smiling. Some were already dabbing their eyes with tissues, anticipating the emotional significance of what was about to occur. Sarah walked into the courtroom holding James's hand on one side and Dakota's leash on the other, a picture of confidence and belonging. She wore her white dress, which had carefully selected to make her feel special, and her small face was radiant with a joy that seemed to illuminate the entire room. This was not the same child who had entered a courtroom months earlier, vacant and traumatized and disconnected from the world. This was a child who had learned to trust, to love, to believe in permanence. This was a child who had been healed by the combination of a therapy dog's intuitive gentleness and a family's consistent, unconditional love. Judge sat in his elevated position, and for a moment, his professional demeanor seemed to waver slightly as he looked at the child who had transformed his understanding of what was possible in family court. He began to read the adoption finalization papers, his voice steady but warm. He discussed the legal implications of the adoption, the transfer of all parental rights and responsibilities from the state to James and "This adoption is being finalized," Judge said, his voice carrying the weight of profound significance, "with the understanding that Sarah Martinez, now Sarah, is becoming a permanent member of this family. She is no longer in the custody of the state. She is no longer a foster child. She is now, in every legal and moral sense, the daughter of James and—" The courtroom remained completely silent, suspended in the gravity of the moment. Judge looked directly at Sarah and asked, "Sarah, do you understand that James and will be your parents forever and always? That they will love you and take care of you, and that you will always have a home with them?" Sarah looked up at James, then at Dakota, and then in a voice that was clear and confident and filled with absolute certainty, she spoke words that would echo through everyone's memory for years to come. "My dog, my daddy, my mommy." The courtroom erupted. Judge stood up from his bench, began crying openly, her shoulders shaking with the force of her emotion. The other social workers stood and applauded. Dr. Robert removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. James pulled Sarah close and wrapped her arms around both of them, and Dakota somehow positioned himself so that he was part of the embrace, his tail wagging slowly, his presence completing the circle of what had become a family. Years later, long after Sarah had grown into a confident, articulate young woman, she would tell her story to other children in the foster care system. She would explain how a dog named Dakota had given her permission to speak, to trust, to believe that she could be loved. She would talk about the moment in the courtroom when she claimed Dakota as hers, not understanding that in claiming him, she was also claiming her own capacity for recovery and healing. Officer James became an advocate for bringing therapy animals into courtrooms across the country. He gave presentations at conferences and community events, explaining Dakota's role in Sarah's transformation and arguing passionately for the integration of animal-assisted interventions into the foster care and family court systems. His work helped dozens of other courts begin similar programs, and countless other children began experiencing the same kind of healing that Sarah had found. Discovered that motherhood, even motherhood that began with a traumatized child and a complicated adoption process, was the most fulfilling experience of her life. She and James went on to foster and eventually adopt 2 more children, both with complex trauma histories, both of whom benefited from Dakota's presence and the healing environment that James had created. Sarah, Dakota, James, and became more than just a family. They became a symbol of hope within the child welfare system, proof that miracles did happen, evidence that sometimes the most broken children could be healed through love and connection and the unlikely intervention of a gentle dog. The words "my dog," "my daddy," "my mommy" became a rallying cry for reformers and advocates who believed that the foster care system needed to embrace more creative and holistic approaches to healing traumatized children. And on quiet evenings, when Sarah was curled up between Dakota and James on the couch, safe and loved and finally home, nobody in that living room would deny that something close to miraculous had occurred. A traumatized child who had been labeled as permanently damaged had found her voice, claimed her family, and taught an entire system that healing was possible when the right elements came together: patience, love, hope, and sometimes the unconditional devotion of a dog who understood that his purpose was to help people find their way home to themselves.